You ever find it strange that, the same Christian apologists who claim that Christianity is a philosophically intellectual religion will also sometimes get really shady on whether or not they support young earth creationism or special creation or theistic evolution or whatever? This makes me glad I'm a heathen. I haven't really engaged on creationism before, but maybe it's time that I do. The heathen and Christian perspective on myth are quite different, and I think that right now, I need to clear up a myth understanding. So this was a while ago, but I had an interesting Twitter exchange with another YouTuber named Braxton Hunter, who has excellent hair, by the way. But he, for a long time, I've seen as having like some decent takes on criticizing how atheists engage with theists.
What we see among some atheists is a desire to demonstrate or show that what atheism gets you, that what the theistic arguments get you, is not Cartesian certainty. And so long as it's not Cartesian certainty, we shouldn't have to believe it or shouldn't be expected to believe it because skepticism. Now, some of you might reject that. And as I always say on this show, if the shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it. I'm not talking about you if this isn't you. However, I've shown that with a lot of atheists, this seems to be the case.
But Braxton started engaging in some interesting rhetorical strategies that I've seen from atheists. And I think he was playing a bit of a mirror game, purposefully, but it got into something that I think is really interesting and that I think highlights a differentiating challenge between speaking to heathens and speaking to Christians. So we're going to go through the conversation I had with Braxton, break down the exchange, and highlight, one of the major differences in approach. Now, before that, I want to make some caveats. Braxton has suggested that he is not a young earth creationist, and in general, I think that he's an honest agent in this conversation. He seems to be in this to help guide people to Christ, which, while I think Christianity is ultimately harmful, I can respect the intention. So this was the original statement. I felt it was, mostly reasonable. But my impression of this statement was that the truth of evolution does not mean that Christianity is false, which I agree with, and I stated as much here. And this is true. During my time as a Christian, I never understood the issue that so many Christians had with evolution. I was a dinosaur nerd as a kid. I would dig into paleontology books. One of my favorite books as a kid was Raptor Red by Robert Bacher. So when I started seeing depictions of dinosaurs on the Ark as a kid, my immediate response, again, as a kid, was that humans and dinosaurs just didn't live at the same time, and they were from different geological layers. So I love the movie 1 Million Years BC, but it's not a documentary. Creationists confuse me. They always have. And I've never found there to be an issue with scientific exploration and its compatibility with religion. My position has been, for as long as I can remember, that if there's a truth on the matter, that it would be compatible with reality. And science helps us explore the physical element of that reality. So it makes sense that whatever spiritual reality there is, it would be compatible with a scientific understanding. I can understand the perspective of viewing science as incomplete. I mean, heck, that's how scientists view science. I can see the perspective of science not exploring the same areas as religion for the most part, but when creationists advance a worldview that overtly claims things that can be demonstrably shown to be untrue, I have no idea why people double down on such a position. So, I made my post and moved on. I figured it was agreeable enough. But then I saw an exchange between Braxton and my friends over at Divine Disbelief, links below. And it got my noggin jogging about how Braxton was approaching this conversation. And it seemed to be in a way that was fundamentally different than the way I thought. So I asked him, because I don't want to make assumptions about his position. So for a minute, it seemed like he was making a science denial position. But I feel like clarifying questions are always a good way to start these conversations. And he did clarify that he held a lack of belief in evolution, which I thought was funny. Christian apologists are often frustrated with the lack of belief position. I admit to being frustrated with it too. I think that it results in a hide the ball approach to a conversation. And I've seen Christians make the same criticism, so I was surprised to see Braxton make the same kind of statement. But, being a theist that regularly engage with atheists on this, I know the game already. You get into reasons, you find the objection, you deal with that. Because the lack of belief statement is pretty much irrelevant as soon as it's said, because it's kind of a nothing burger. It doesn't describe much of a position. So you got to dig a little bit deeper and find a meaningful statement before there's really a conversation. So we take the statement, I lack a belief in evolution, and we throw out some bait to find the objection and see if he bites on any of the common ones. And I thought it was interesting that he bit on abiogenesis, given that it isn't evolution. I legitimately thought that he would say that abiogenesis isn't evolution, because that's the point that atheists who debate this issue will hammer home like it's no tomorrow, but he took it. He did suggest, however, that he's not a young earther. Even if he didn't state it explicitly, he did dismiss young earther objections pretty clearly. So I moved away from baiting that out. But I wanted to know if there was an actual objection to evolution or if it was just something else. I chose the wording of this question carefully. Are we related to bananas is a reference to Ray Comfort, who is often hailed as the Banana Man. Banana. Anyway, I'm not sure if Braxton is aware of that. It might be before his time, but it's a strong enough meme that, it might have rung a bell.
Behold the atheist's nightmare. Now, if you study a well-made banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 ridges. On the close side, 2 ridges. If you get your hand ready to grip a banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 grooves, on the close side 2 grooves. The banana and the hand are...
Banana phone, I've got this... Anyway, so the question results in kind of an easy test question, which I was upfront about. Do you actually object to evolution in some way? Because this would inform to what extent one holds an opposing viewpoint. And it turns out that there actually isn't an objection, or so it seems. He says that naturalistic evolution is off the table for a variety of reasons, none of which are cited. But he surprises me again by saying that he sees 2 viable views, theistic evolution and special creation. Now, this surprises me on 2 counts. 1, I had no idea what special creation was. And 2, theistic evolution is still evolution. So how does he lack a belief in evolution if he still holds evolution as one of his 2 viable views? My assumption is that he doesn't accept naturalism for a similar reason that I'm not a naturalist. I disagree with it. I think gods exist. But that being said, I don't have much of an issue with science not considering deity in its search for knowledge, considering the limitation of the tools we have. That's fine. Science, done in this way, doesn't have any bearing on the gods. That's why you can be a scientist and a Christian or a pagan or whatever. My lack of knowing the term special creation is a little embarrassing for me. I honestly don't tread the creationism space very often. As I said earlier, it was never relevant for me as a Christian. And it's especially not relevant to me as a pagan. So many of the terms within it are just, they're lost on me. I had a varied past as a Christian. I started out in a Baptist tradition that wasn't fundamentalist, and then we moved. And the new Baptist church that we started going to was a fundamentalist church that wound up creating tension between them and my family because we just weren't fundamentalists on like several levels. So we moved to an Episcopalian church, which had a less familiar tradition, but a more familiar community. And that was the majority of my time as a Christian. It was as an Episcopalian and then later as a Pelagian Celtic Christian. So when Braxton said to me the standard Sunday school explanation, my experience with Christianity was such that what he eventually explained would never have been taught. And in fact, it would have been taught as the wrong belief. And I was in the rural South. It's a minority belief in the rural South, but I was there nevertheless. But, looking further into this conversation, I discovered that there is a version of this that is compatible with theistic evolution called special transformism, which is that eventually near-human animals were given souls by God and thereby became human. Catholicism holds to something similar to this, that special creation applies to the soul and not the body. So God created our bodies indirectly through an initiation of the cosmos, and this is even used to explain the special relationship between humans and God, that he's created our souls. So I never learned about any of this in Sunday school, so it honestly wasn't a question I asked, in spite of all the annoying questioning that I did as a Christian that got on the nerves of youth pastors. I saw the creation story in Genesis as an account that was a message to humans that the world was God's creation for us, and that we were charged with taking care of it. And this informed my position as an environmentalist, as a Christian. Step one to becoming a dirty pagan, I guess. But whatever the case, the position that I held as a Christian didn't necessitate a debate over what was meant by the creation of humans. I saw the story as an allegory. And the creation of man and woman from the dirt is part of that allegory, that we are part of the earth and part of creation, even though we are charged with its care. And later, as a pagan, I see the creation myths in a very similar way. It's not needed to see the myths as literal in order for them to be true. Polytheists even generally hold to this concept. Those that don't are referred to as mythic literalists, those who believe the myths to be literal to the letter. They're extremely rare among pagans, and the general community scoffs at it or corrects it. I've bumped into a lot of pagans in my life now, and I think I've bumped into like 2 or 3 of these. Most often, when mythic literalism comes up, it's to denote that we're not mythic literalists after having such a position applied to us, such as by someone suggesting that because they don't see the gods on top of Mount Olympus, this somehow disproves polytheism. Anyway, back to Braxton. I reference mythic literalism to him, and it's not a common term among Christians. I don't think they use it at all. Christians tend to be afraid of the word myth when talking about their myths. But I think that mythic literalist applies to creationists. Creationists are the mythic literalists of Christianity. And honestly, I think they should be treated the same way, just noted as ignorant to their understanding of the text. And I would expect a reasonable apologist to want to teach a more appropriate understanding of the text through his content. But I was legitimately surprised that he didn't do this. Like, honestly, this was my assumption, but at the beginning of the conversation, I didn't pin Braxton as somebody who held a position on science like this. I figured that with the complexity of how he deals with his other arguments, that he would understand why mythic literalism should be abandoned. Like, it's not a historical understanding of these stories from their place in antiquity. It results in absurdities anyway, such as young earth creationism. And I bring up a heathen example of this, that our legends point to a creation story of Odin creating the universe from Ymir. Now, would we hold by tradition that the universe would then therefore possibly be constructed of a dead god? Maybe. It's an interesting prospect. Not something that we can really explore in any real way, but it's certainly an interesting possibility. But do we conclude from this story that Odin fashioned the earth out of Ymir's skull, and that then therefore the earth was once a skull? No, it seems pretty obviously not the case, given our current understanding of the universe. But we don't need to interpret the myth that way in order for it to be true. It would be kind of metal, though. But again, this kind of approach is common not only among polytheists, but among Christians as well, just, more so among polytheists. Reconstructionists in particular tend to be history buffs. And we know that this wasn't the kind of thing that mattered to the people that were following these ancient faiths, even if they held to these positions. What mattered was reciprocity with deity and engagement with the gods. Just because these myths contain these story elements does not mean that the gods do not exist, or that our exploration of spirituality isn't valid. And the same can be said of a Christian, or at least it should. What matters to them is this whole salvation thing, not whether or not a literal Adam and Eve were once dirt before a timeless and spaceless God fashioned them into humans. That seems pretty obviously false and contradictory. But, they do their thing. Which gets to the main point here. Braxton kicked a beehive talking about how atheists are proud of science, specifically with evolution. But, they are. Their movement and identity is often associated with science enthusiasm, even if it's not informed. But, whatever. But the reason why atheists get to claim that is because Christians cede it to them by tolerating proud scientific illiteracy within their movements. And I'm seeing more and more how apologists in this scene will be wishy-washy on scientific issues like evolution when they demonstrate the philosophical aptitude to know better. And it makes me wonder if they're doing this to maintain cohesion in their audience. Christian audiences on YouTube seem fairly divided between theistic evolutionists and creationists. And they'll fight a lot, but neither group, will go after a creator if they just stick to the philosophy and the history. But here's the kicker. This scene attracts the extremes, and I've seen Christians who defend evolution get pulled away from Christianity time and time again. And an element at play is that they'll get ostracized from Christian groups on the internet, and then fall in with the atheist circles who don't care about theism so much as they care about other things, because those are their allies in the evolution debate. And furthermore, Braxton points out that he cares more about getting people to come to Christ than about this element of the conversation. I can identify with that. For my content, I care far more about educating on polytheism and making it more accessible than I do about the evolution debate. But I can afford not to focus on the issue because heathenry isn't rife with mythic literalists. Our movement isn't associated with the denial of evolution. Christianity is, and strongly. And so the Christian salvation narrative becomes associated with science denial and mythic literalism. And if this was the trend in heathenry, you bet I'd be standing against it just as I do against other issues that I find among heathens. So honestly, the leaders among Christians that should know better need to start leading on the issue. Because otherwise, this snowballs for them as less and less Christians speak up about this issue and continue to cede scientific literacy to atheism. And honestly, I wouldn't give a damn if I thought this would only affect Christians. But unfortunately, different kinds of theism do get lumped in with each other by critics in their ignorance. So when Christians keep messing this one up, for the same reason I stated above, it might become necessary for a heathen to say something. Drop a comment with your thoughts. This video was a bit of a journey, but I hope it gave you a new perspective. And with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Before we go, back in the OG days of debate YouTube, like when the website was young, there was a Christian in the mix named Don Exodus. And after years of engaging and educating on science as a Christian, he later became an atheist, and his channel is dormant. But his perspective as a Christian was one that I could get behind back in my Christian days. I'm going to leave you with some of his comments on evolution and God, because I think that his position is right on the money, and one that Christian apologists in the scene now could learn from and emulate. And with that, remember to find a way or make one.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for checking out my video. This is Don Exodus, and thanks in particular to all my recent subscribers. If you guys like what you hear and want to hear more or have any requests, definitely let me know. This video in particular is addressing the compatibility of evolution and God. Now, there are two types of people who are trying to misuse evolution in relationship to God. There are creationists who are saying, I believe in God, therefore evolution has to be false. They're completely misguided in this effort because, again, evolution says nothing about God. And there are also atheists, and this group is often overlooked, who tend to try and use evolution as a means or as a proof of there not being a God. Now, this video is more so to address the latter. Because what atheists often don't realize is that evolution is a completely natural theory involving natural processes in an attempt to explain them. Therefore, as such, it makes absolutely no reference whatsoever to supernatural causes or events. Evolution simply doesn't address God, so you can kind of go with that how you will. Now, one thing that people also kind of don't necessarily understand is that the only thing that evolution does specifically rule out is a 100% literal interpretation of the Bible, which anybody who's ever read the Bible hopefully knows. Chapter 30 of Leviticus goes on and on talking about how God is a rock. And unless you believe that God is a piece of granite sitting somewhere in Utah, then you already agree that the Bible uses literary devices and metaphors. I mean, that's simply fact. It's what the Bible uses. Secondly, something that uses literary devices isn't necessarily false. Okay, the creation story could still be an allegory and be true. It's just not to be read like a science book, and the problem only comes when people try and use it as such. Same thing with science, however. Science isn't meant to explain supernatural events, and when atheists try and use science and evolution in particular to attempt to disprove God, they're not only demonstrating their ignorance on the subject, but they're also using evolution just like the creationists are, in a manner in which it was not intended to be used.